Hello, good morning, and thank you for joining us. My name is Preston Bucady. For those of you that have joined, we're here to talk today about ISO 27001. And what's interesting today is we're going to be looking at ISO in the context of the COVID pandemic and just how exactly this security framework can not only help protect you and your business in the midst of a changing work environment, but also how a lot of companies are addressing this issue and approaching certification or annual audit in the midst of a work from home or telework environment where their employees may be spread out all over the place based on various local regulations. So again, I just wanted to say thank you for those of you that have joined so far. I certainly know that in today's day and age, we're often coming back and forth from Zoom meetings, so we might just give it 30 more seconds for folks to perhaps grab a coffee or hit the restroom before they sit down and join us today, where we'll be discussing keeping free from COVID, how ISO 27001 protects remote workers. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. For those of you that are joining late, just something to remind yourselves, this session will be recorded and some handouts sent later. Of course, always, if you have any questions that arise either before or during the presentation, please do send those out over to those. That way I can try to address those on the call here or perhaps send out a written answer later. So just a brief introduction on who I am, who you're listening to this morning. My name is Preston Bucady. I'm an attorney and consultant with IT Governance, and I spend a lot of my time helping companies understand and comply with data privacy and cybersecurity laws. And so for those of us here in the United States, we're familiar with lots of different laws in this space, right? Depending on the industry that you work in and the types of data you process, you may be dealing with a variety of different type of laws like the California Consumer Privacy Act, the General Data Protection Regulation, the New York Shield Act, HIPAA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, and others. That's what I spend a lot of my time doing. And of course, I do that in furtherance of IT governance, where we try to offer a one-stop shop solution for all the compliance needs that an organization may have. Legal and regulatory issues in privacy, cybersecurity, and perhaps just data more generally are getting increasingly complicated as various countries deal with this issue from a technological perspective, from a national security perspective, and increasingly global society is trying to understand how data can be used, monetized, weaponized, etc. And so various countries, various regulatory bodies are all coming out with different standards and solutions that organizations have to comply with. It can get incredibly complex and complicated, and so IT Governance's goal is to help educate you on these topics and try to teach you how to fish, so that not only can we help solve the problems initially, but you can manage these issues yourself going forward. So today, what we're going to be talking about is how ISO 27001 would work in the new landscape that we are all effectively stuck in for the time being, right? Until a vaccine is created or until people feel safe to go back outside, we are expecting to work from home or at least work in some sort of telecommuting environment for the foreseeable future. Organizations need to understand the impact to their information security infrastructure that has now come about as a result of their employees largely working from home, perhaps sharing computers with kids and other people who are also stuck at home. And then we also want to understand, hey, if we're trying to elevate and mature past this, if we're trying to protect these issues and control for these risks, what sort of standards and tools can we implement? How can we make this process easy, right? Because ultimately that's what my goal is trying to be for my clients is how can I make this process easy for you? So I'm trying to not only show you the benefits of implementing ISO and how it can protect risks that might exist in this new threat landscape, but also how you can implement this to protect your company and how you can do so in a manageable way. So like I said earlier, if you have any questions that come up over the course of this webinar, please send them to us at the email you see on the slide. Would love to answer your questions. And as always, if we get a bunch of good questions, happy to send out written responses to those attendees afterwards. And of course, you're always welcome to send us an email or other outreach after the webinar. Don't hesitate to reach out with questions you might have on Friday, next week, next month, whenever they come up. So let's go through a brief overview of ISO 27001, right? Because we need to know what we're talking about in order to really talk about it. So what is ISO 27001? Well, really, it's an information security standard. It's a framework that allows companies to sort of pick and choose what sort of security tactics they're actually going to use to implement at their company and ultimately protect data. And so you see there that bottom bullet, ISO 27001 is about managing the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your important data, your information processing systems and facilities, and other assets that have value to the organization. Now, the benefit of using ISO 27001 is its international acceptance, right? There are a variety of local and even national cybersecurity and data privacy standards here in the United States. Many of you on the call may be familiar with some of them. There's the CIS-20 controls, there's NIST 853 and 171. For the nerds on the call like me, you may be aware of the new CMMC coming from the U.S. Department of Defense. All of these standards pull on and learn from the experience that has come from ISO 27001 because it's been out there in the wild, through industry, accepted across the globe, approaching now 20 years, right? So this standard actually came about, matured over the course of the late 90s, was published and developed in the early 2000s, and it has continued to improve and been revised since then. So what are we really talking about when I talk about ISO 27001? Well, we're talking about creating an ISMS, and what that stands for is an Information Security Management System. And I stress those last 2 points particularly, right? This ISO 27001 is not going to give you instructions out of the box on how to secure your laptops or how to build a secure network. No, this is really a management methodology, right? It's a system for managing your information security program. And so to that end, hopefully those of you on the call already have some element of cybersecurity in place at your organization. Unfortunately, if you don't, I would recommend hanging up and go talking to your IT team immediately, because as we all know, for those of us that are in the know, data breaches and issues relating to personal information happen all the time. Data is passed around, it's transferred internally and externally, and as a result, there's a lot of risk that relates to that data, right? It goes back to the CIA of our assets, the confidentiality of our data. That's the idea that data is accessible to who it needs to be, sort of a need to know concept. There's also the idea that we should be protecting the integrity of data, right? If I go into a database, I want to know that that data is clean and useful, and it actually says what I need it to say. Lastly, we also want to make sure that data is available, and that's literally the availability of data so that I can use it when I need to. For those of you that are on the West Coast of the United States, you may have noticed last afternoon that Microsoft servers had a down outage for about 30 minutes or so. As we all know, when we can't access our information, especially in today's day and age when information is increasingly digital, it's electronic, and it's at our fingertips at every waking moment, the availability of that data and the lack of access creates a problem unto itself. And so ISO 27001 is really about creating a holistic understanding so that an organization can appreciate, hey, what are our assets? What are the tools, the technology, the services, and the data that really drives and creates value for our organization? That's the stuff we need to protect, right? Our IP, our tax information, the sensitive data of our employees and their partners, our sales contact lists, our marketing materials. All of that is important information that an organization can monetize, and so it should take steps to protect it. That's ultimately what ISO 27000 is about. It starts by having us try to understand what exactly are we protecting, right? What are those assets of the organization that are in scope and they fit within the context of our organization, right? Because as you can imagine, the security standard for a company like Facebook is certainly going to be different from the security standard of a technology startup in someone's dorm room, right? So we have to understand the context and scope of our business to understand what assets drive value to that business, and only then can we start to ask and analyze and in turn understand what sort of controls do we have in place? What sort of risks are posed to those assets, and how are we dealing with them? So the pillars of information security that ISO 27001 is truly built on are people, process, and technology, right? Because as you just saw on that last slide, the first fundamental step in ISO is figuring out who you are as an organization. What is the context? What are the requirements? What are the assets I need to protect? Now you can go around and start planning those protection mechanisms, right? In ISO parlance, we call those security controls, and security controls often fall into one of three buckets: people, process, or technology, right? And so again, for those of you that are in the IT department and you've joined the call today, thank you for your time and energy. We know how much work you do, and I know you guys understand that you can deploy technological tools to help control for risk. For example, VPNs, multi-factor authentication, right? There are ways you can lock down and tune up systems to make sure that they do what you need them to do in terms of technological and risk control, right? Turning on encryption on an AWS bucket is a perfect example. However, technology is not the end-all be-all, right? Because as Target knows, technology only works as well as you set it up. So we also have to have processes, right? Documented procedures that explain how we're supposed to use technology at our job and in our day-to-day functions so that we can in turn control for risk, right? And what I often tell my clients, you can think of processes as nothing more than an instruction manual. And really do think about it in that way, right? When KitchenAid or Whirlpool sells you a dishwasher, they send you an instruction manual that is in multiple languages. It covers every issue you could think of, and it's really intended so that any user could pick it up, read that manual, and install the dishwasher, right? That's what we're trying to achieve at a corporate level. We want to make sure that as personnel turns over at the organization, as people get hired and fired, we want to make sure that new personnel are doing the same job to the same standard and level of quality that old personnel were, right? They were basically following the same steps, using the same tools in the same approved way. In turn, that's all controlling risk. Now, all of that's well and good if it weren't for the human beings involved, right? Because as any lawyer can tell you, people are often the weakest link when it comes to controlling for risk, because you can have the greatest, most expensive technology in the world, and you can have the most process-oriented operations department on the planet, but it's all for naught if your human beings don't actually understand what they're supposed to do or follow through on it. So the people part of our controls understanding really comes down to, hey, how do we make people aware of these processes and technology that we've implemented? How do we get them trained up so that they are actually qualified and competent to follow the instructions we've laid out for them and use the tools we've given them? Have we actually made sure these people are skilled and qualified, right? Doing a little bit of background checks and making sure that the people we hire are literally capable of doing what we ask them to do. And then, of course, we also want to make sure that it's not just at the onboarding and offboarding stage. We want to make sure that during the operational life cycle of the business, we have adequate amounts of resources and we have good capacity management so that, for example, if a good number of your staff need to disappear around Labor Day because all of their kids are going back to school and then the school's shut down and they have to come back home, it's about making sure you have enough staff on hand to cover when people are out so that people aren't rushed, they aren't anxious, they don't cause accidents and create more risk, right? So it's only by combining this triad of people, process, and technology that you can truly control for risk. And it's important to understand that because, again, ISO 27001 is not a black and white list of switches to flip or buttons to push. It is a management system methodology. And only true, mature leaders at an organization, in my experience, incredibly rare, often lacking in the C-suite. And for those of you in the know, right, C-suite, that just means the degrees they got in their diploma. True managerial leadership in terms of risk control and governance at an organization has to rely on this intersection of people, process, and technology. It's the only way you can really get things done. So how does ISO 27001 address this? Well, check this out. It's got a family of documentation to help guide you through. So when I say ISO 27001, I want you to remember this slide right here and look over on the left. ISO 27001 at its core is really just a set of clauses describing a management system methodology. And in fact, you see that green circle over there with 4 through 10? That's really the meat and potatoes of ISO 27001. It's actually incredibly short. Clauses 4 through 10, not a lengthy amount of pages. What you'll find when you actually look at a copy of ISO 27001, right? Back in the olden days, we used to go to printers at an office and cut down trees and print things. You'll find that ISO 27001 is a hefty document, but in fact, most of those pages are taken up by the Annex A security controls. So again, something important for you to understand when we talk about ISO 27001, there is a difference between the actual standard to which you are certified, right? Those clauses that deal with things like planning, operations, support, leadership, risk assessment. We'll talk about those more here in a second. Compare those to the actual guidance, right? The listed suggested security controls found in Annex A and the education and guidance and implementation advice that's found in 27002. So the point of this slide is, again, to demonstrate this interrelationship between the documentation, because again, ultimately what you will find when you play around with ISO is there are very like chapters in a book, right? And so I want people to remember that 27001 is really the important chapter. That's the chapter you get certified to, right? That's the chapter you tell the world about. But there are other chapters of the book that are no less important. You see at the top of the slide, we've got ISO 27000, 000. That's the introduction, the application, and the terms and definitions, right? And so that actually cuts across these various chapters, some normative references, that kind of thing. Whereas our Annex A controls, although technically found in 27001, the guidance and the detail and the information on those controls is found in 27002. So going back to that slide I just showed about people, process, technology, if you don't know where to start in terms of information security, ISO has not left you hanging out to dry. Again, like I said earlier, ISO 27001 is truly a management system methodology, but they have helpfully provided a list of 114 security controls broken down into 14 control categories to help give you an understanding of how exactly to manipulate and massage different security controls into a cohesive program that provides an element of governance to senior management across the organization. So this graphic on this slide is really meant to represent ISO. It's IT Governance's own representation. Now bear with me as I walk through this, because what you'll find, you'll see that the green circle is on the outside. They're in no particular order. That's because ISO doesn't really have a particular order, right? I've said it time and again now, it's not a black and white list of things to go do. It's about a holistic approach to management at the organization. And as any good manager can tell you, you are constantly in a position where you have to plan objectives, support people to meet those objectives, outlay operational resources to achieve those objectives, and certainly at a certain point you want to evaluate whether you've met objectives and try to improve upon them, right? So it's kind of always going on at once. And here at IT Governance, what we've actually come to find is that leadership and risk assessment truly drive this process, right? It drives every element of this process from the top to bottom. Nothing gets done at a corporate organization or any organization really without a strong tone at the top that's driving this all the way through. Now from there, risk assessment is actually going to give you an articulated sense of what needs to be done, because as you saw a couple slides ago, we can really only understand what security we need once we understand what the context of our organization is and what assets we have, right? So all of this stuff is going on within the context of our organization, that gray background, but we are constantly looking out for risks, trying to analyze our risk posture and understand our approach so that we can constantly plan for risks ahead of time, support people to meet objectives, manage day-to-day operations, and then also evaluate our performance to make sure that we are actually meeting our objectives, controlling for risk, and ideally making it better next time, right? So we're not reinventing the wheel every time. We're just chiseling it a bit down each cycle so that it gets better and better and better over time. So you saw this slide on the last graphic, and again, it's just broken out in more detail. We start with leadership, right? So the clauses of ISO 27001 would say you need commitment from leadership, often demonstrated by a policy. And what's more is you need to clarify specific roles and responsibilities so that people actually know who is doing what, so that that stuff gets done, right? As one of my old bosses like to say, it's about having a proper throat to choke, so that when something doesn't get done, we know who to go chase down and yell at. Now, of course, it's not just all running around yelling at people. That's not a very efficient way to run an organization. And so that's why part of this involves an element of planning and support, right? We try to look ahead and see what problems we may face so that we can address them ahead of time. And we also try to look at what opportunities we may have so that we can take advantage of those and perhaps position ourselves as a leader in the market. A perfect example, as privacy regulation rolled out across the globe years ago, many companies approached that as a risk to their business model, right? A cost of compliance. Whereas other companies actually addressed that as an opportunity. It was a selling point for them to go to their customers and say, as a matter of fact, we don't have to deal with these laws because we've already got your data protected. And you should be doing business with us anyways because we've already been protecting your data. This is not something we have to do now. So they took what should have been a risk in terms of legal and operations and compliance, and they turned it into an opportunity. It's only through planning and support that we can do that, right? By setting objectives and giving out plans to achieve them, we can start to see where are we spending our resources, where are our existing competencies, and how can we use that to create opportunities for ourselves as a company, or to at least control risks to maintain our operational efficiency, right? So operations ultimately still coming down to that element of day-to-day work, planning and control, going around and doing stuff. It's only at the end of that cycle can we then sit and say, hey, did we actually do what we intended to do? Did we meet our objectives? Were our plans adequate, efficient? Could they be improved? That's really ISO 27001 in a nutshell. So how can this be used to mitigate risk while working remotely? Well, the great way that ISO sort of forces you through this is, as a result of the ISO effort, you are going to have some sort of risk-based approach to decision-making at the organization, right? So when we talk about ISO 27001, we're talking about the information security program, and as a result then, we are trying to say that our information security program, right, the way we manage information security risk at the organization is going to be in part dictated by the types of risks we face as an organization. So a lot of organizations will take that and they'll try to understand what risks do they face or could they face in terms of things like events, right? Accidental information disclosures, power outages or interruptions, theft of laptops and other assets, poor designs or errors in code, right? The other thing to consider is your regulatory, legal, and contractual requirements. But you see, there's all types of other risk scenarios that'll be out there. And that's really the key, is by forcing you to think about these issues and address them through documented analysis, you'll be better positioned to prepare. As Dwight Eisenhower said, planning is important, but plans necessarily are not, right? Because as soon as you hit the beaches in Normandy, your plan might go out the window. But simply sitting through and planning and preparing is never a bad idea. And so what we have found at IT Governance is those organizations that were already ISO certified before the pandemic struck earlier in March, February of this year, they, excuse me, they were actually able to respond much better. They were positioned in the market. They already had things in place like a continuity plan or disaster recovery. Long story short, they were able to hit the ground running, whereas many other businesses had to confront this scenario for the first time. And so when they did, as we've helped numerous other clients walk through this effort over the course of the crazy year it's been, we try to get them thinking about these types of topics, right? How are you going to evaluate risk at the organization? Because not every risk is a big deal, right? Not everything at the organization is worthy of bringing it to an absolute halt. And so the point of risk analysis under ISO is for an organization to determine an acceptable level of risk that meets with its organizational requirements. And from there, the organization can identify activities and processes that are critical to keeping above or below that risk level. So we can start to understand these things on the right and their impact on what that risk level may be, right? What's the value of our information and our information assets? What are the legal and regulatory requirements we have from local jurisdictions or international bodies? What about our contractual obligations? That's often one that my clients forget about. You've undoubtedly signed lots of agreements with business partners. And if you don't think so, frankly, you're wrong. Those agreements have rules and requirements. They have obligations. Go back and read them to see what you are on the hook for. A great one to look up is your insurance policies. Go make sure what you have to do in order for that policy coverage to kick in, because you'd be surprised at all the outs and the excuses that are laden in that fine print from the insurance provider. So that's ultimately where we derive number 5, right? What ISO tries to get you to do is think about all the stakeholders in your business. Your customers, your partners, your suppliers, your vendors, your regulatory bodies, and your own employees, including contractors and people that are maybe only on site for a certain amount of time, like the janitor staff that's overnight. What are all their needs, expectations, and interests in terms of legal, contractual, and other baseline security requirements? We can use that as a starting point to build up our security program, because really this stuff is the bare minimum that we have to have, right? It's the absolute basement bottom of our tolerable risk level. Now, once we determine what our bottom level is, we can start to look at the risks we face and try to determine the value they have in terms of, hey, how likely is it that this risk is going to occur? And if it does occur, what would be the impact, right? So for example, I'm not necessarily concerned about an asteroid hitting me in my office today. It's just not that likely. On the flip side, I'm increasingly concerned that Microsoft Server might be out for a bit of time. So I've taken steps to download my files and work them offline, right? So ultimately what we're trying to do here, get that granular understanding of the impact of a risk multiplied by the likelihood of that risk occurring, so that we can help understand, hey, at the end of the day, when the rubber meets the road, are we really worried about this thing? Yes or no, right? Is it going to happen? And if it does happen, would it be a big deal? We're trying to use that to get a level of risk analysis, driving towards a level of quantifiable or qualitative analysis so that we can literally rank and understand our risk posture. So you can see here, there's a level of granularity that needs to come with this understanding. Again, shifting away from that common trope of the C-suite where we just run with yellow, red, or green, right? Because we all know people in the C-suite, they don't have a lot of attention or energy. No more, right? They are managers, executive leaders of the organization, and they need to have this granular level of detail in terms of how the organization is managing risk to information security, because ultimately these are risks to the company in terms of operations or liability, and it's ultimately a risk to information and data, increasingly the lifeblood of any organization, right? So when we talk about risk assessment under ISO, we're trying to determine, hey, what would be this impact if confidentiality, integrity, or availability of our information assets was compromised, and how likely would it be that that risk will occur? Now, when I'm doing this with clients, often people ask me, hey, what sorts of threats do I need to worry about, right? Do I need to worry about North Korea sending a bomb? Do I need to worry about Russian spies? No, not necessarily is my answer, but it often depends on the context of your organization, right? Again, ISO is meant to be context specific. It's tailor-made. It's not a off-the-rack solution. You are supposed to tailor it to you. But here are some common threats to think about, and I'm going to give you one more that you don't see listed that I know all of you have had to face. So obviously things like social engineering or equipment malfunction, those are common issues in a business in 2020, right? Lots of employees have mobile devices like laptops or smartphones, right? We are often working with remote connectivity, so there can be issues around lost devices, lost equipment in terms of power or utilities, records being destroyed, information being accidentally disclosed. Yeah, Preston, we get it. What's another common threat? A global pandemic, right? The idea that your employees can no longer show up on site for some reason, perhaps a terrorist attack or other disaster like a fire or flood. But how are we going to respond, right? Because we have to keep the lights on. We got to keep the money flowing. It's not an excuse for you to say that Microsoft went down and that's why your business is closed for the day. Not a very mature response from a corporate organization. It would work for my cousin's lemonade stand at my aunt's house, not so much for a corporate entity that employs other personnel, pays taxes, employs staff, etc., right? So we have to prepare for some of these common types of issues and think through them so that in turn we can create a corresponding control structure that will help us plan for this eventuality. And so then, what are we supposed to do when we choose these risk treatment options, right? We are faced with a risk. What are we meant to be doing about it? Well, we fundamentally have 4 different options. We can avoid the risk by eliminating it entirely, right? Just get rid of it. Stop doing it. We can also modify or treat the risk by applying different security controls, right? Picking from that list from Annex A and implementing those controls to see if there's a corresponding impact or reduction in likelihood on our original estimation of that risk. Now, of course, you can also share a risk with a third party, basically kind of cut your losses and maybe split the bill with someone else, perhaps a supplier, a vendor, a service provider. Often that's done through contract. And of course, you could just retain the risk, right? As long as something is within an established or tolerable level, senior management could decide that ultimately this is a risk they are willing to live with as an organization, and that's fine. Again, ISO 27001 is about a management system. It's a methodology for approaching and controlling risk as it relates to information security. We can't get rid of every single risk, right? In the same way that we cannot make sure that every single virus will be protected and vaccinated against. At a certain point, we just have to live with the way the world is, and ISO appreciates that and builds that understanding in. It allows for senior management to accept a risk as long as it's been subject to review and has been defined or determined to be at an acceptable level. So again, right, our 4 options when it comes to risk are essentially we can treat that risk, right, by modifying it in some way. We can tolerate the risk, essentially retain it, live with it as is for now, perhaps put it on a roadmap to be reduced in the future. We could terminate the risk, right? We could avoid it entirely and just get out of that activity, often the easiest answer in terms of legal issues, but from a technological or operational perspective, it may be more difficult. And then, of course, we can transfer the risk as well, right? We can share that risk with another party and try to get some other folks involved. Increasingly, number 4 there is implicated by a shared responsibility model when you've got software as a service, platform as a service, or infrastructure as a service. The more that your responsibilities for security are offloaded to a service provider like your Amazons or Azures of the world, the more you need to review your agreements with those parties and make sure you truly understand who is responsible for what in this shared responsibility model. You may be surprised to find out that Amazon and Microsoft aren't willing to share in your risks and liabilities. So go back and read your agreements, read your end user license terms, and make sure you've set up your technology appropriately. So how do we implement ISO 27001 during a pandemic? Well, ultimately, it's no different than doing it in what I'll call normal times, right? Essentially, you do the same project management methodology. The real difference is that you've just got to adapt your work style to this remote connectivity world we all live in, right? You've got to be flexible in terms of timing. You've got to be willing to meet people on the phone or on a Zoom call, but ultimately it's the same stuff, right? It's the same exact thing. It's just in a different technological setting. So we start with our project mandate, right? Meeting with senior leadership to understand what we're trying to achieve. And from there, we go out and start the project, right? We kick things off and start to put together our ISMS, our Information Security Management System, right? We try to understand what the context of the organization is, what is our baseline security criteria. From there, we can start to implement a management framework, right? Trying to understand how risks will be assessed, how they will be analyzed, and correspondingly, how they'll be treated. So over time, you can see that green circle is filling in. The shades are becoming more clear because we're growing. By step 5, we've built the baseline of security criteria, and we've started to build that into our operations and support, right? We're already trying to meet those objectives. It's only by that point that we can start to turn and look at prospective risks, right? And really implement that risk assessment process in more detail so that we can say, yes, we've controlled for the bare minimum requirements we need in order for this business to run. We've also controlled for future risks and other operational issues. In turn, that's perhaps allowed us to address some of those risks or create opportunities. And from there, we've just got to measure, monitor, and review, right? We've set up all these security controls to help control risk. We got to make sure they actually do what we intend for them to do what we think they are doing, right? If we go and turn something on, we better check every once in a while to make sure it's still up and running, right? From there, you can proceed to certification, telling the wider world, hey, we're ISO certified and we're ready to go. So again, your project phases, right? You start with a mandate to kick the project off and you graduate all the way through to implementation. This should align with the theory of ISO itself, right? You start with leadership, right? So that's why your project mandate starts with leadership, because you go get support. You get the resources you need, and you start to think about where can we improve on what we're doing today. Understand what your requirements are in terms of baseline security, right? Build up your wall, figure out what you already have, determine what you may need, and then from there you can elevate and graduate to start to build on top of that, right? And so truly, this is how you build defense in depth, if you ever hear IT folks talk about that term, right? You're building these layers of security by constantly going through this iterative cycle, right? You implement security controls, you monitor, review, circle back and look at your baseline requirements, make sure you're meeting them, do a risk assessment, review, circle back. It's meant to be iterative. It's meant to be cyclical. It's based on the fundamental methodology that underlines all management methodologies. Your Kaizens, your Six Sigmas, your black belts, your who knows what invented by Tim Robbins or some other guru. It's all fundamentally relying on the same basic way that human being brains have operated for 10,000 years. We plan in order to meet goals. We do to try to meet those goals. We check to see if we've met those goals. And then if not, we circle back and we act, right? Plan, do, check, act. Plan, do, check, act. It's the same basic methodology you take to the grocery store, right? You create a list, you go around and get your groceries. While you're standing in line, you make sure you got everything on the list. And if you didn't, you take the corresponding action. The tricky thing about implementing ISO in the midst of a global pandemic is this new threat landscape we have to consider, right? Because ultimately what you are going to find is that you or your IT security department has built up an infrastructure that's really based on the idea fundamentally that people will be in the office plugged in. And now they aren't, right? They're at home using their devices at home. They're using their home networks, which may be shared with, teenage boys who've got a little too much free time at home because school is online. You may have employees that are sharing computer assets, right? For those folks that have multiple family members working from home, there's a lot of activity over the network. There is a lot of controls that are presumably not implemented because these people are often using out-of-the-box solutions from an ISP. There's a whole different security architecture. And so as a result, when you are working in this space, this remote teleworking environment, you need to sort of consider and be prepared to understand, how does your traditional security architecture change when people now work from home, right? Do they now need to sign on to a VPN if they're no longer on the corporate network? Well, what about if they've got their own personal device, and you can no longer monitor that use, right? All kinds of different funky and interesting details that we have had implicated by the shift to a work from home. Now, the benefit of going after ISO, even in the midst of a global pandemic, is really about supply chain security. People often ask me, Preston, what's the point of doing this? And I'll tell you, if you want me to be blunt, it's a brand recognition tool. I do believe that following ISO's management methodology will help you inherently build better security at your organization. But if you talk to your CISO or others in the IS department, you will invariably find that they've got all kinds of ideas and suggestions when it comes to information security. So what's the point of doing it the ISO way? Well, number one, I would tell you that it brings that level of management system methodology. It's a little bit more coordinated, structured, and it builds a level of interoperability across the organization by grabbing folks from different departments, getting their accountability, getting their input, getting their buy-in, so that you're not just implementing security controls through the dictatorial actions of the IT department, but no, this is more of a managerial discussion to control risk across the organization, right? Doesn't that sound much better? But what's more is that it helps tell the world the same story, right? Again, you are no longer just cherry picking IT security controls from some list of the latest and greatest things that Microsoft's willing to sell you, but you've actually taken a dedicated, holistic understanding from a managerial level as to how the company is dealing with information security and IT-related risks. So often what we have found is that our clients are facing an increasing level of scrutiny from their suppliers and business partners in the, what I call the data chain, right? So somebody gives you data or they buy a service or product from you, and somewhere up the chain, they have been asked about cybersecurity issues, undoubtedly because this is increasingly a topic that appears in our news, right? We've seen court cases out of Europe over the summer. The Trump administration is continuously talking about data transfers with China, this deal with TikTok. It's all related, right? So more and more companies are wanting their partners to go on record, hey, if we give you data, how are you going to protect it? Are you going to store it safely? Are you going to create liability for me? Are you a Cambridge Analytica who's going to get me on CNN next year? Nobody wants that. So these big companies are trying to understand, how can we get this level of assurance in our supply chain? Well, historically, they've relied on contracts, but increasingly courts are not letting that fly. It's no longer enough for a multi-billion-dollar business to say, oops, we signed a contract and that's all we did. That's what Facebook did in 2016 with Cambridge Analytica, right? And so many legal regimes around the world are saying, no, that's not enough. You need to do some level of affirmative due diligence before signing a contract with a service provider. We can't just be giving out this sensitive data willy-nilly. The idea that we're sharing social security numbers and birthdays and blood type and all this other sensitive information, no, it needs to be controlled, protected, maintained. And so increasingly, companies are shifting to a questionnaire or audit model, where they're having their partners literally go on record to say, here is what we do when you give us data. Here is how we will protect it. Here are the steps we have in place in terms of security, in terms of insurance, in terms of people and personnel, right? Confidentiality obligations and non-disclosure agreements, what have you. The problem with questionnaires is that they can vary greatly and they require time and effort to fill out, right? If you don't want to be in the business of simply filling out questionnaires, you're going to need a way to breeze past those. And so increasingly, that's why we're shifting down the scale to the audit and accreditation model. The idea is that there should be some sort of industry-recognized seal of approval that tells organizations just how you manage information security. We should be trying to move away from this in-depth due diligence and moving more towards a industry-recognized best practice seal of approval that indicates to the world, yes, we have got our stuff under control. That's what ISO is about. It's that accredited certification model that's internationally recognized to offer your suppliers and partners the recognition that you have a managerial holistic response to information security issues across the company. Now, I just threw a lot of word vomit at those of you on the call, and I think this graphic really interprets what I just said quite well. Ultimately, over time, the world has seen more issues in regards to how corporations manage, maintain, and store personal information, right? Think of it, Sony, Target, Equifax, Yahoo, Facebook. The list of data breaches goes on, it seems to never end. Well, over time, more and more companies have recognized that as a risk. More and more governments have recognized that as a societal risk. And so as a result, more and more companies are moving to a certification model that demonstrates they have got security under control. And so you see from this slide that over time, ISO 27001 certifications have increased, and that number has upticked even since 2016, especially in light of all of the increasing scrutiny around this topic, right? We've got the GDPR, the CCPA, the New York Shield Act. Every once in a while, I still get emails about some senator or congressman who thinks they're going to push through a federal privacy or security law. I would argue our government has a little more to deal with this year, but there's more regulation in this space, and so as a result, industry is circling the drain on some kind of best practice framework or model. Increasingly, that's opting to be 27001 because it gives you a level of certification, a level of independent audit. It's just a little bit more adaptable for an international audience. So what can you do to start to move toward that level of maturity when it comes to information security, right? Whether it's protecting your own organization from a work from home environment that will probably continue indefinitely in some degree for the foreseeable future, or whether you really are trying to do this as a business value and brand builder. The first thing to do is obviously review resources. We've got all kinds of information and tools available on our website to give you an introduction to this topic. And I do recommend poking through that information because ISO can be a bit of a weird understanding for a lot of people, especially for Americans. I find that there's a lot of IT folks in the United States that come to this with an expectation that there will be a black and white list of things to do, right? A checklist. Give me the 10 things I need to go turn on and I'll be done. Like I've hopefully demonstrated over the course of this call, ISO is not quite that simple, right? It's a management system methodology. So please, at first, educate yourself, get informed. It will make the process a lot easier. You're always welcome to reach out to someone like me or any of our other practicing consultants to help guide you and give you information on this topic. But once you feel like you've got an understanding of what ISO is, go around and identify your controls, right? Conduct a detailed gap analysis based on those 114 controls in Annex A, or perhaps on a different controls framework, like I mentioned, NIST, COBIT, SIS-20, and others. Compare that to the ISO framework and see just what level of gaps you have and what amount of remediation work may be involved in order to close those gaps. Now, of course, you can always build your competency, either you as a professional or others at your organization, by attending one of our training courses. So we offer a variety of training courses around ISO, from a one-day foundation introduction all the way to longer courses that truly teach you how to implement ISO from a project management perspective, or even how to audit ISO if you want to become a certified auditor. And those courses are certified by GASQ. There are exams at the end. And so build your competency with a demonstrated course and actually understand what ISO is. Of course, you can also take some of our online training options. But ultimately, once you think you've understood ISO by participating in training or educating yourself, you can go around and start tackling these tasks, right? Very much in the ISO sense. Figure out what your requirements are and build a plan. Start to outline support and resources so you can do the plan. Build in a level of monitoring and review, some kind of internal audit activity so you can evaluate performance against the plan. And then, of course, continually improve, right? Build it back in and take those findings and feed them back into the cycle. So for a certain amount of time here, limited time only, we're offering a discount on our training courses, mostly as an appreciation because we know so many folks are still working from home, still trying to figure out how school and work and life is going to look this fall. At least with IT governance, we've decided to say, hey, don't worry about this for now. You can take our longer dedicated training courses online. We've got them set up for remote test taking as well, so you can get certified on these. Of course, you can always just skip ahead to the actual meat and potatoes and get going on your ISO work, right? So like I said, we've got all kinds of training and resources available to help you build your competency and confidence, but we've also got a variety of DIY tools that you can take and use to build your own ISO program, right? DIY packages, policy documentation toolkits, a variety of implementation guidance and resources freely available on our website. And of course, I'd be remiss without noting that if you have sat through this entire presentation trying to keep your eyes open and you're thinking, gosh, I don't really have any interest in this, there are dorks like me who are more than happy to do it, right? We spend our day and nights thinking about ISO, dreaming about ISO, and so more than happy to guide you through this effort ourselves. Or of course, again, like I said earlier, if you just want to talk about stuff, give me a call, send me an email, visit us on our website, or reach out on social media. We're happy to talk to you about these issues. And if anything, like I said earlier, I'm a nerd on this topic and I just like talking about it. So if you need some help falling asleep on a Friday night, maybe you're back on a business trip and you're on an airplane, give me a shout. I'm happy to bore you to death on more ISO information than you can ever want. But my goal, as with everyone at IT Governance, is to make sure you are not only informed and educated on this topic, but that you have everything at your disposal that you could possibly need in order to manage and take this effort forward on your own. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions. I'm cognizant that we are nearly at the top of the hour, and so I appreciate those of you that have joined and stayed with us this whole time. I hope that the information was valuable and useful to you. Again, fundamentally, it's not difficult to implement ISO remotely. It just requires a sort of permuted or twisted understanding of how your IT security infrastructure is going to apply to people now that they're all working from home, right? They're no longer physically coming into the office, so you can't rely on things like the firewall on the corporate network. Where if you do, think about how it will be rolled out to people across the country or perhaps across the globe. So again, I'm going to open it up for questions just now. And I'm navigating here on my questions feature. So it looks like we have one question. And this is a great one that I often get from my implementation clients. The question is this: how are we going to be audited? Because if you think about it, a lot of different states in the United States, certainly different countries, have all kinds of rules about travel and who can go where and what businesses are open and what businesses are closed. I'm located in Denver, Colorado, and the rules seem to change almost weekly. So the question from the audience is, how are we supposed to get an auditor on site to actually do this stuff? Great question. In speaking to certification bodies, which I've done, and I know several other of our consultants have done this as well, it seems as if certification bodies will actually allow for remote virtual auditing as long as this COVID pandemic continues. And that should make sense, right? If you are familiar with ISO concepts to their core, you'll know that auditing, that check part of the cycle where we continually improve and try to review our activities, it's based on a sampling method. Because in theory, it's too much work to audit a whole company all at once, right? I got other stuff to do every day. So you try to do a sampling method. You sample a little here, you sample a little there. It's like when my partner runs through the kitchen and I'm baking something, right? You take something out of each bowl and maybe that gives you a sense of what I'm up to. ISO is the same. And so my impression is that ISO audits will continue virtually and that there will be a decreased emphasis on physical security this year because most people will be at home. In turn, there will probably be an increased emphasis on teleworking security and remote infrastructure. So the idea is, in theory, this year, yeah, they're going to do virtual audits. They'll set up a Zoom meeting with you. They might have you share your screen or show the office you're in, right? Turn on your webcam. So some of us might actually have to shave and get a haircut this year. But you sort of just go through the audit as best you can virtually, and undoubtedly when those auditors are able to come back on site, They will go through other elements in more detail to make sure they've gotten a full understanding of the entire ISMS. So hopefully that was a good question for that person, or at least a good response. I've got another question here. It says, if you are certified through ISO, are you covered regarding other frameworks such as CIS, NIST, COVID, and others? So the easy answer there is no. The trick is ISO is the only framework that has an official certification scheme. So if you get certified to ISO, that does not necessarily cover you automatically for some of these other frameworks. Now, undoubtedly, there is a lot of overlap. And for whoever asked that question, I would ask you to actually find me on LinkedIn or shoot me an email, because I've got a nice graphic that I can show, and it's buried in my email, so I can't share it now, unfortunately, but I've got a nice graphic that shows this level of overlap. There is overlap between CIS, NIST, and COVID. A lot of the controls are actually kind of the same. That's a secret between you, me, and the fence. But what you'll find is, again, certification under ISO doesn't necessarily guarantee coverage under the other ones. It might get you 70, 80, 90% of the way there, but you're still going to have to go through that gap analysis to make sure there's any kind of final gaps that are closed, because they're not exactly aligned. What you have to kind of remember is that all of these different frameworks were invented by different people or industry groups for different reasons. So ISO actually evolved from the British government and their regulatory scheme, whereas NIST is actually more of an American thing, right? So that's a perfect example. If you are doing business with someone in France and you mention NIST, they may not have any idea what you're talking about. But if you mention ISO, they may know exactly what you're talking about. The question then becomes, how do you translate those two, right? They're both basically the same, but there are some minor nuances and differences. So the follow-up to that question was, do you have materials or courses mapping all the controls and explanations? Yes, absolutely. And again, to the person that asked me that question, please hunt me down on LinkedIn. I'm very easy to find. Of course, I've got links buried throughout these handouts, so when you get those, you could find me. But if not, go to Google right now, type in Preston Bucati. I'm sure you'll find me on LinkedIn. Send me a note, shoot me an email. I've got all kinds of materials that cross-map ISO to other frameworks. You may even regret contacting me, because I will send you so many PDFs, you'll never have enough free time to read them all. But yes, I've got all kinds of mapping tools, spreadsheets, PDF, books. Again, I'm a nerd on this space. If you reach out to me on LinkedIn, I apologize in advance, because I'm going to get very excited and send you a bunch of stuff. And it's more than okay to say, hey, Preston, dial it back. Close the fire hose. I don't need a 40-page document explaining some of these things, but I'm happy to chat through it. So yeah, again, shoot me a note. For those of you that are still hanging on the call, shoot me a note on LinkedIn or reach out to us through our service center here. I'm happy to send you some of those resources to help make some of this more clear, maybe give you some tools you can use in your activities and your operations day to day. As I scroll through my chat feature here, I'm not seeing any more questions. So I appreciate those questions that did come in, very good questions. And again, hopefully my answers were useful to you. Don't hesitate to give me a shout to continue the conversation though. With that, guys, I'm going to say that if there are no further questions, I just wanted to say thank you all for joining. I know, again, that your time is increasingly precious as we all adapt to this live at work, work from home mentality through the rest of the year. So I am appreciative of your time. And again, if you've got any questions on ISO 27001, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're happy to educate you and inform you on this topic. Those of you that have attended my webinars know that there will be more webinars on this topic going forward. So stay tuned to us and our channels for more information on ISO. Of course, we've got blog posts. And like I said, you're more than welcome to reach out to me individually, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have or point you to a resource that I think could help as well. So with that, again, Preston Bucati here from IT Governance. I just wanted to say thank you all for joining. I appreciate your attention and energy as we talked about ISO in the midst of a global pandemic. I hope this information has been useful to you, and please reach out to us so that you can get more information. If you've got more questions, concerns, don't hesitate to give us a shout. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Stay safe